Last time we took a look at the 5 pillars of Islam, which are the 5 things that you really unite all Muslims together into one ummah, into one community, into one body. The Dar al-Islam, right? The House of Islam. Today we're going to be taking a little bit of a different direction. We're going to be taking a look at some of the points of distinction between the two major branches of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. And if I'm going to use the analogy again of a house, maybe I shouldn't call them branches, but wings of the house. So the Sunni and the Shia, which are the two dominant groups. Remember, those split apart very, very early in the history of Islam, right? Within 30 years of the death of Muhammad, you have this division, which has lasted all the way through to today. So we're going to take a look at the distinctions between the Sunni and the Shia. And of course, we're not going to be able to cover nearly all of them. We're going to be covering just a few of I think key differences between the groups, but it's going to be, as we always do, just an overview of those distinctions. So let's go ahead and start to talk about these two sects. And when I use the word sect, we could think of sects and subsects, because even within Sunni and Shia, there are other divisions that have taken place over the centuries. So it gets to be a very complicated picture, as you'll see very shortly. So let's start by looking back at that division itself, the origins of the division very briefly, which took place after the first fitna, or as a result of the first fitna. If you remember, fitna is the first civil war in Islam. And this has to do with the figure of Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the fourth caliph, the last of the rightly guided or Rashidun caliphs, who dies in 661. Now, he was a blood relative of Muhammad, and that becomes an issue of contention between the two sects, as we'll see. He's going to pass the caliphate down to his son Hassan and later Hussein. He's going to try to resume the caliphate. But it was a debate about succession that brings about the division, right? The supporters of Ali say that the caliph should be a blood relative of Muhammad through Ali. And then the supporters of Uthman, who is his opponent, are advocating for shura, or the idea of a consultation, the committee election, right? The community choosing the caliph. So this debate between the Umayyads, really, under Muawiyah and Ali, you've got the first fitna, which is between 656 and 661. It was kind of a dragged out series of conflicts. So, for instance, you've got a couple different coalitions against Ali. You've got the Aisha coalition, which fought Ali at the Battle of the Camel in 656. She and her supporters were defeated by Ali. And then you've got the Muawiyah faction. If you remember Muawiyah, he was the governor of Syria. He was the Umayyad. He was a kinsman of the previous caliph Uthman, who had been assassinated. So the Muawiyah faction does battle in 657 against the forces of Ali at the Battle of Siffin. Okay. Now, Ali tries to negotiate with Muawiyah. You have the Night of Clamor, where the white flag is essentially raised, and Muawiyah's troops call for an arbitration. And then among Ali's supporters, you've got mutineers that basically also want an arbitration. And Ali agrees, right? He concedes to this idea of letting a couple arbiters settle the matter of the caliphate, and kind of trying to maintain some semblance of peace in the midst of all of this actual warfare and conflict. Now, the arbitration is not going to go very well. It's actually going to result in an absolute division between these two groups. So it's a political division. Now, you've got the arbiters, Amir ibn al-As, who is the arbiter for Muawiyah, and you've got Abu Musa al-Ashari, who is the arbiter for Ali, who is kind of forced on Ali by the Qurra among his supporters. Now, what these guys end up doing is coming to an agreement where they depose Ali, and Amir ibn al-As ends up advancing Muawiyah for the caliphate. Now remember, Ali doesn't go along with this decision, even though he has said he is going to go along with whatever the arbiters decide. He doesn't like this outcome, as you would imagine. So this is where the split begins. And the first split actually is not between Sunni and Shia, but among another group known as the Kharijites. So the Kharijites, remember, are this group that kind of forced the arbitration on Ali, and they are going to be ones that start to view themselves as the only true Muslims, right? So this is the first real splinter sect in Islam. And there are still Kharijites today, though they're a very, very small minority today. Okay, they actually did battle against Ali's forces at the Battle of Narwan, but you can think of them as a third group, though I don't want to really put a number on the groups because, like I said, it's going to get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So the real split is going to be between the Sunni and the Shia. So let's talk about the Sunni-Shia split. That's where we're going to focus the majority of this lecture. The Shia, the name comes from the Shia Ali, or the sect of Ali, Remember, they're the ones that say Ali is Caliph. He's the true Caliph. Matter of fact, they go so far as to say he's the first true Caliph because they believe in this blood succession idea, and he's the only one of the 4 rightly guided Caliphs that was a relative of Muhammad. Okay? The Sunni, or the traditionalist, the normative version of Islam, favored the Shura, the committee selection. So that's the real big point of distinction in the beginning. It's over authority. Now, 661, you have the death of Ali. He's assassinated by a Kharijite, and he leaves behind his son, who succeeds him as Caliph, Hassan ibn Ali. Now, Hassan cedes the caliphate. He doesn't maintain the caliphate because he was interested in avoiding civil war with Muawiyah, who had already been declared caliph by the arbitration, and he kind of gives it up to Muawiyah. Later, he's actually killed, remember, by his wife, probably at the instigation of Muawiyah to get rid of any threat among the family of Ali. So Hassan out of the picture, and the last son, or the younger son of Ali, a guy by the name of Hussein, tries to resume the caliphate in 679, tries to take it back, and fails. Right at this time, you've got Muawiyah and the transition between Muawiyah to his son Yazid, who's going to be the next caliph, hereditary successor, by the way, because remember the idea of committee selection wasn't even adhered to by the early Umayyads. They start to go towards hereditary succession, very much like kings and Roman emperors and such. So at the Battle of Karbala in 680, you have the destruction of the small forces of Hussein and the death of Hussein that takes place, which is a very important period of mourning, or a monument of mourning within the Shia tradition, the passion of Hussein, the martyrdom, and the mourning that goes on even to this day on the 10th of Muharram. All right, to celebrate. I shouldn't say celebrate. I have a tendency to do that. It's a holy day, but it's a time of, mourning for this great figure who is really slaughtered. Remember, the battle was not really a battle. I mean, you want to think of it as even forces on a battlefield. It was 5,000 of the Umayyads against about 70 people. So it really was a slaughter and a martyrdom, and that's the way the Shia view it. Okay, so that's essentially the division. So what I want to now focus on for the rest, or at least for the next little portion of the lecture, are the distinctions between the Sunni and the Shia. Right? There are a lot of differences between the groups, like I said, and we're only going to look at a few of the key differences. So let's start by taking a look at just the 2 major sects in general. Now, let's start with Sunni, and then we'll talk about the Shia. Sunni would be the normative Islam. Right, it comes from the word sunnah, which happens to deal with the words and the actions and the examples of the Prophet Muhammad, the traditions of him, what he said, what he did that is passed down. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But as far as Muslims go in the world today, about 85% of the Islamic world are Sunni Muslims. All right, so that is by far the vast majority of Muslims. Doesn't mean everybody is absolutely uniform in how they practice their Islam, but they're going to be united on at least the major basics. Okay, now the Shia are obviously going to be the minority. The word comes from the Shi'atu Ali, or the Shia Ali, meaning the sect of Ali, and these guys are the ones who believe that Ali is the chosen successor. As a matter of fact, according to their tradition, when Muhammad gave his farewell sermon at the Pond of Qum, which was on the 18th of Dhul Hijjah, this is right after his last Hajj, right, his last pilgrimage to Mecca, he gives his farewell sermon, and in his farewell sermon, he actually proclaims Ali as his chosen successor. Now, the Sunni don't have that in their version of his farewell sermon, but the Shia account does. Okay, so they believe that Ali is the authentic representative of everything that Muhammad stood for and taught, right, in contrast to these objectionable Umayyads. So they make up about 15% of Muslims today, and they're primarily found in Iran and in southern Iraq. Okay, so that's kind of the Shia stronghold today. Now, let's take a look at this issue of the Caliph, and we're going to introduce another term, which is Imam, which I don't think I've given you before. But the Caliph we talked about this idea of a successor to Muhammad, and that's exactly what the Caliph was. And of course, there was a question as to whether this was a successor as far as prophethood goes, or was it just a successor as far as the office goes. And of course, the Sunni believe that it's only the office that the Caliph holds. Right? There are no further prophets, nobody inspired in that way after the time of Muhammad. They're the ones that favor this idea of shura, the idea of consultation, the election of the caliph, not based on blood relation. You don't have to be a relative of Muhammad to be in this position. Now, currently, the belief is that the caliph, that office is vacant, that there hasn't been a caliph since the 1920s, okay, when it was abolished. Though there have been attempts to revive the caliphate really in the last decade or so, or maybe a little bit more than a decade now, but I don't want to get into some of those issues. The imam is a little bit different. Now, the imam we're going to speak a lot more about when we get to the Shia, but for the Sunni, the imam is merely just the leader of a Muslim congregation. This is the one who leads prayer in the mosque. He's the one who provides the sermons. The term is actually also used of respected scholars. Okay, so it's not, well, you'll see the difference when we get to the Shia in just a second, but that's what an imam is. So, any local mosque probably has an imam that presides. Okay, kind of like a pastor of a church, I guess you could say. And I don't want to make too big a deal of these comparisons when I do make comparisons to Christianity or things you might be more familiar with, because they're not exactly the same, obviously. So let's talk about the Shia, right? The Shia, as far as the caliph goes, got to be a blood relative, right? And that would be Ali, and then anybody that is follows Ali. So Ali is the first, right, authentic caliph according to the Shia. And he's also the first of what are known as the imams. Now, an imam in Shia, very, very different. These are divinely appointed descendants of Ali. Not just any descendant, but certain descendants of Ali have a divine appointment. And they have what's known as isma. Isma is this idea of infallibility and sinlessness. Right? If you've heard of the idea of papal infallibility in Roman Catholicism, this is even more so the case of the imam in Shia Islam. All right, so they possess divine knowledge, they possess authority, and they're also inspired, and that they can interpret the Quran. So they are kind of, I guess you'd say, maybe one step below an actual prophet. Right? Now, most Shia believe that there is no current imam, but that doesn't apply to all Shia. There are actually a number of sects within Shia that believe there are currently somebody like an imam presiding. And the big debate among the different sects of Shia is going to be, how many imams were there and things like that, which we're going to get into. And I promise you it's going to be confusing. I'm going to do my best to try to simplify it without distorting it, which I'm sure I'm going to fail at. But let's go ahead and take a look at first the Sunni Caliph and the transmission of that office down through time. We already covered this really when we did the historical overview, but this is just kind of a quick recap. So remember, the first of the caliphs was Abu Bakr, right? Died in 634, 2 years after Muhammad himself. Followed by Umar, followed by Uthman, followed by Ali. Those are the four Rashidun caliphs, the rightly guided ones. Now, after Ali, we just discussed that the caliphate shifted to the Umayyad family, and this was with Muawiyah in 661. He dies in 680. The caliphate remains in the Umayyad family until about 750 or thereabouts, when you have the Abbasids seize control of the caliphate. And they're going to hold on to it until 1258, when the Mongols under Hulagu Khan come in and they execute the last Abbasid caliph, Mustasim. Okay, now, that doesn't mean it was the end of the caliphate. You actually have an Abbasid caliph installed in Cairo, Egypt by the Mamluks in 1261. So you've got maybe a few-year period where there's nobody holding the title of caliph, but this shadow caliphate is going to continue in Egypt until 1517, and that's when the Ottomans come in. Now, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I brings the caliphate from Cairo up to Constantinople, and he becomes the next caliph. And you have caliphs all the way through to the 1920s, the last one being Abdul-Mejid, who is actually pictured on the screen. This is Abdul-Mejid II. But in 1924, Mustafa Kemal, who is the founder of the Republic of Turkey, right, Ataturk, abolishes the caliphate effectively. And then that was the end of the caliphate. And that's what's been essentially the situation up to this day. All right, so that's the history of the caliphate. And again, there are lots of Sunnis that would like to see a revival of the caliphate. As a matter of fact, the whole ISIS movement in the modern era was an attempt to reinstall a new caliph as at the head of the Islamic community. Anyways, let's take a look now at the imams. And like I said, this is going to be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try to do this with a, what's it called? Kind of like a family tree of imams. And it's going to be a branching family tree. And I tried to do this, as I built this family tree, as a coherent way as I could. Okay, so let's just take a look first at this slide. You see the first four imams. Ali at the top, his sons Hassan and Hussein follow him, and on we go. I'm not going to read every single name on this chart because that would be way too many names, but Ali is generally considered the first imam, right? Now, this is not true of every single sect. There are sects that don't count him as the first, like the Musta'ali don't count him as the first, and then there's Hassan, who's usually termed the second imam. Hopefully I didn't say caliph a second ago. I think I did. I meant imam. But Hassan is not counted as an imam by the Nizari sect. So again, the numbers are going to differ from the sects. And the other thing that's going to differ is the succession. Every once in a while you're going to have debate as to who is the next in line. So for instance, after the fourth caliph, you've got a debate as to who should be the fifth imam. I keep saying caliph. I apologize. The Zadis favor the fifth imam as Zaid. Okay, and the Zadis are therefore known as the sect called the Fivers, right? Because they are followers of the fifth imam. Many of the others are going to follow Muhammad al-Baqir as the fifth imam. Okay, and you're going to trace forward from Muhammad al-Baqir. So going down the list now, let's zoom out just a little bit further, and we'll get to the sixth imam, which is very important. This is Jafar al-Sadiq. And Jafar is going to be really, really important. We'll talk about him later when it comes to Islamic jurisprudence, because he founds one of the most important schools of jurisprudence among the Shia. Anyways, he was the sixth caliph, but after him there's another division, a rather big division. And it's going to be a debate as to who's the seventh imam. The Ismailis believe it's Ismail. Okay, Ismail is the seventh imam. And there are some of the Ismailis that actually trace the imamate not through Ismail, but through his son, Muhammad ibn Ismail. So there's a little bit of debate whether Ismail or his son is the seventh, but for the most part, let's say Ismail is the seventh imam. The Nizari and the Musta'ali sects actually count his son as the seventh imam. So again, like I said, it's confusing. Now, there's actually a third name that could be put out there as the seventh imam, and this is where the big division actually comes within Shia. The seventh imam, according to the Ithna-Ashari, is Musa al-Kazim. Okay? So the Ismailis follow Ismail, and then the Ithna-Ashari, who are known as the Twelvers, as you'll see in a second, are going to be following Musa al-Kazim. So let's follow that branch for a little bit. So this is the most important branch, I would say, of Shia Islam. Not to denigrate any of the other branches. When I say it's the most important, I mean it's the dominant branch. This is the majority of all Shia today are part of this tradition that's illustrated in the red. So following Musa al-Kazim, you go down to the 12th imam. The 12th imam is a guy referred to as Muhammad al-Muntazar, meaning the hidden imam, or Muhammad al-Mahdi. And we'll talk about this idea of a Mahdi in a little bit. This is kind of a messianic figure. So anyways, the followers of the 12th imam, okay, is a group known as the Ithna-Ashari. They're also known as the Imamites, or they're known as the Twelvers, because they only believe there were 12 divinely appointed imams. And there's been no imam since the 12th imam. Okay, so those are the Twelvers. But a lot of other people hold to a lot of others following that different lineage, right? Following the seventh imam as Muhammad ibn Ismail. You can go all the way down. Here I'll just stop at various points along the way. But the 11th imam, Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah, is the founder of what's known as the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. It was an attempt to revive the caliphate office in Egypt, and it was going to last there in Egypt from 909 to 1171. So there's not only a caliph in Baghdad, there's also a caliph in Egypt. So you have two caliphs during this period. And the Fatimid Caliphate is actually a pretty important one, historically speaking, especially when we get to the discussion of control of the Holy Land during the Crusades and things like that. Anyways, going down further along the list, you're going to run into another important figure in the Fatimid dynasty, which is Al-Hakim. Al-Hakim is the sixth caliph in the Fatimid line of caliphs, but he's interesting because he was also a severe persecutor of Jews and Christians for a while during his reign. As a matter of fact, he destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and a number of other churches and stuff in the region. And it was kind of memory of this destruction and persecution that was still present at the time the Crusades were declared at the end of that same century. So this is kind of the thing that was coming back to Europe, these kinds of stories sparked by figures like Al-Hakim. Anyways, he's going to be really important in the fragmentation of another sect known as the Druze. The Druze are people that really adhere to almost a worship of Al-Hakim himself, who's believed to have gone into occultation. Occultation is this idea of hiding. So I'll talk a little bit more about that down the road. But going down even further, we'll get to the 18th Imam al-Mustansir, and again, there's a split between two possible 19th Imams. If you follow Ahmad al-Musta'ali, you end up with the Musta'ali sect. If you follow that chain a little bit further, after the 20th Imam, there's a split again at the 21st. Some follow al-Hafiz, they become the Hafizi sect. If you follow al-Tayyab, you become the Tayyabi sect, okay? And the Tayyabis, incidentally, have a passing down of the imamate all the way to, Tayyab himself is viewed as the last imam, but they do have a successor that's passed down today. There's an office known as the Dai. So currently there still is a Dai of this sect that is currently, leading the community. Anyways, let's go back to the main line, the green column that we have to the left, and if you follow down to the other 19th Imam, Nizar, you have the Nizari sect, and the Nizari sect continues to have imams even to this day. So currently there is an imam, I believe we're on the 49th Imam in the tradition, which is a guy by the name of Aga Khan IV, if he's still alive. As to a couple years ago, he was still alive. But so again, for the majority of Shia, which would be the 12ers, you have no imam since the 12th imam. With other sects, you still have the possibility of there being an imam. But again, it gets incredibly complicated. And that's just a few of the different sects that have emerged out of Shia. There are many, many others. Okay, so when I talk about the general view of Shia, we're primarily referring to the picture that we get out of the 12er sect, the Ithna-Ashari. All right, so let's get out of this complicated chronology or lineage and go back and talk about some other really important things, such as the Sunnah and Hadith. So, beyond the Quran, there are significant disagreements as to what counts as an authoritative source of Islamic teaching for the community. The Sunnah is very, very important. Sunnah simply means the way. It's literally, the well-trodden path, or the straight path we can think of. This is the oral tradition. These are the orally transmitted narrations that record what Muhammad did, what Muhammad said, and things like that. And it constitutes the example for the community. It really functions as a secondary source for Islamic jurisprudence, which we'll get to in a little bit, which is Islamic law. All right. Now, it was very common among ancient communities to preserve things in this way through an oral tradition of the ancestors. So this whole idea predates Islam. Okay. Now, when I say it's a secondary source for Islamic jurisprudence, I mean it's second after the Quran. The Quran, of course, is primary. That's the most important source of authority that Islamic law is going to be built upon, but the Sunnah is number two. Now, the Sunnah is preserved not merely in an oral way, it's preserved in a written way in what's known as the Hadith, or Ahadith, plural. The Hadith are the codified, written narrations about what Muhammad said and did and approved, the Sunnah. So once the Sunnah has been written down, we could refer to it as Hadith. Now, Muhammad's words and actions are going to be the standards of emulation for the entire community. If you want to know how to do this or how to do that, how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to say prayer, right? You look back at the example of Muhammad. It's like this idea, what would Muhammad do? And that's the standard that the Islamic community is supposed to abide by. Okay, it's at least the golden standard or the ideal. Now, let's talk about Hadith, because there are different collections of Hadith depending on if you're Sunni or Shia. Among the Sunni, there are basically 6 canonical Sunni collections, right? It doesn't mean there are only 6. There are actually more than 6, but there are 6 that are considered at the top, or they're the most reliable. At the very top of the list is Sahih Bukhari. Okay, this was written around 846, and this is the most authentic and widely accepted of the Sunni Hadith. Now, al-Bukhari wrote this stuff down, and he was a student of a guy by the name of Ali ibn al-Madini. Now, Madini developed a classification program for how you classify different hadiths. So, you might be in the category of Sahih, which means sound. That's the best, right? If a hadith is considered Sahih, it means it's completely reliable. Or it's Hasan, which is good. Or it might be Da'if, which is weak. Right, so he began this whole classification as to what's a good or bad hadith tradition. And this is based on what's called the isnad. The isnad is a chain of transmission. a chain of oral transmission. So if you pick up like a copy of Sahih Bukhari, and you could find this on the internet pretty readily at various sites, and turn to any of the hadith, it's going to begin with what's known as the chain of isnad. It's one of the first things that you're going to be present, and it's basically, Muhammad said so-and-so, and it was basically transmitted through. This is, recorded by like Aisha, his wife, who gave it to so-and-so, who told it to so-and-so, who told it to so-and-so. So it's a whole list of people who heard it from who, right? So that's the idea. Now, if it's a good, strong chain of isnad, that just means that there's no breaks in the chain. We have a transmission. We know who it was that translated it all the way down, and all these people are reliable witnesses, right? None of them have a bad reputation for being known as a liar or something like that. So those would be the types of criteria that you could judge whether or not it's a good isnad or not, and whether or not you've got a sound hadith. Okay, so that's kind of the general. And there's a lot of Islamic study that goes into determining the hadith. A lot of study on hadith in Islam. The second most authoritative collection is Sahih Muslim's collection. After al-Bukhari, as a matter of fact, he was a student of al-Bukhari, and he left a collection of even more hadith, like 9,200, hadith in his collection. Then next you've got Abu Dawud, who's probably the third in line, or Al-Sugra. Some count Al-Sugra as the third most authentic, and then Al-Tirmidhi and Al-Majaj, or Ibn Majaj. So those are the 6 Sunni hadith. Like I said, there are dozens of others, and some of them are really highly regarded, like Muwatta ibn Malik is pretty highly regarded. But I want to turn now and just give you a very quick list of some of the main Shia hadith collections. And I want you to notice among the first of this collection a very big difference that you will not find in Sunni. So if we talk about the 5 main Shia collections, at the top you've got what's called the Nahj al-Balagha, the Peak of Eloquence. Now, what makes this one so unique is that it is a collection of sayings, not of Muhammad precisely, but a collection of hadith given by Ali, the tradition of Ali. Obviously, you're not going to find these in Sunni. So it records his sermons, his letters, everything, other narrations that he's made attributed to the first of the Imams. Okay? So as far as Shia goes, once you get to the Quran, that's your top authority. The Sunnah of the Prophet himself is second most important, and then third in authority would be the sayings of Ali himself. Okay, so they got this other thing in there. But of course they have books that include the traditions of Muhammad himself, and among them you've got what are known as the 4 books of the Twelvers. Remember, the Twelvers are the major sect, so these books are going to be the next 4 really important ones, the Kitab al-Kafi. Also compiled by Sharif Razi, who compiled the Nahj al-Balagha. You've got the Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih, which is a tongue twister. And then you've got the Tatib al-Akam, and lastly the al-Istibsar. So all of these, a little bit later than the earlier collections among the Sunni, right? These are 10th, 11th century documents. All of the ones that the Sunni hold on to were basically compiled during the 9th century, more or less. All right, so now you've got the 2 main authorities. You've got the Quran itself, and you've got the sayings and deeds of Muhammad preserved in the hadith collections. So this stuff is going to go into what's called the composition of the Sharia or the law. Sharia means the straight path, literally the path to the watering hole. This is Islamic divine law. We could call it jurisprudence. Fiqh is another term that we use for Islamic jurisprudence. But this is really the third component when we talk about an Islamic canon. What is the authoritative standard for the entire community? Remember, the term canon refers to a measuring rod originally, right? We talked about a canon in Egyptian art. We talked about a canon in Hebrew or Christian scriptures. You could also talk about a canon as far as Islam goes. That would be essentially the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sharia. Okay, those are the authorities over the community. Now, as far as the Sharia goes, it was a codification of the Quran and the Hadith or the Sunnah, as well as what's known as Ijma. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Ijma right now, because Ijma, which means consensus, is going to be really kind of important. And I'll say why in just a second, but consensus is important in general because we think of the Ummah, right, the body of believers, as being united. So we want some kind of unity, and that means we want some type of consensus. Now, there's a debate in Sunni Islam over the extent of what that consensus should be, or who is part of that consensus, maybe we should say. And since there's a debate, that obviously means there's no consensus as to the level of consensus. So is it the entire Muslim community that needs to be in consensus? Is it the first generation, Muhammad's companions? Is it just that generation that had to be in agreement? Is it multiple generations? Is it the jurists? Is it the major scholars? Right? Those are the things that are up for debate. But the idea is there will be a shura, or a consultation, and people would then have to agree to something. Right, so this third source of authority would also relate to what level of authority you have in the ijma. Is this like a revelation, right? When the community agrees, is that equal to revelation? Is it just a guidance for the community? Is it obligatory? What's the standard? What weight does it have? It can't possibly be as weighty as the Quran, but it's still very necessary. Because if you think about it this way, within the community, over time, you're going to have to deal with lots of different issues that need to be addressed. Now, the Quran, which is a fixed document, it doesn't change, does not address every single issue that could possibly arise. So how do you address issues that the Quran doesn't address? Well, you could resort to then going to the Hadith. Now, the Sunnah were the collections of what Muhammad said and did. Now, before the Sunnah were written down and collected into the Hadith, you can imagine that people were making up Sunnah, right? You have an issue that comes up within the community, and somebody knows, well, what would Muhammad have said about that? Someone would come up with a Sunnah. Well, this is what Muhammad said. Okay, now you could address the issue. So by the time we get to the 9th century, when al-Bukhari's codifying the Sunnah, he actually had to weed through hundreds of thousands of Sunnah to get down to around 7,000 Hadith. Which meant he judged, the vast majority of things already in circulation as just false. They were inauthentic hadith. But once you weed out the inauthentic hadith and put together a collection, then now that collection has become limited and fixed. So if you're going to continue to address new issues, you can't just make up new hadith. You need to come up with some kind of idea like ijma, which is going to be the opportunity to now address those things through a consensus. Very instrumental in the consensus development is what are known as the Islamic scholars, the ulama or the ulama. Now, the different types of Islamic scholars of law, so I'm going to give you a few by name. You don't need to know all of these, but the faqih, which is generally just a lawyer. This is somebody who's an expert in fiqh or jurisprudence. There's the qadi. Those are the judges who kind of rule according to Sharia. Then you've got the mufti, which is a little bit higher. These are the scholars who interpret Islamic law and can issue legal decisions or legal opinions known as fatwa. And then above that, you've got mujtahid, which is a major scholar. Now, what happened over the course of Islamic history is Islam gradually accepted the idea that certain trained ulama could issue what's known as an ijtihad. So what is an ijtihad? Because we can't keep it simple. We have to make it more complicated. An ijtihad is an independent decision, right? So it's the process of making a decision in Islamic law by a personal effort, independent of any school of jurisprudence, okay? So it's the mujtahid, that's that major scholar, that is in the position where they can announce a shura or even an ijma. Now, what does that mean? They can announce a consultation or they can announce a consensus. And they can do this by themselves. That seems a little bit bizarre. So it's this idea that they can then consult, right? There's the shura, the consultation. They consult the Quran and the Hadith, and they'll come up with a personal decision as to what is going to be considered ijma or consensus. So it's almost like one person in the position to make an ijma declaration. And there, of course, is a major debate as to whether this is something that is appropriate, whether it's something that is still possible among major scholars, or if it's something that's closed. This is kind of the idea that they talk about whether the door or the gate of ijtihad is open or closed. So when we talk about the door being closed, it's the idea that nobody does this anymore. Nobody should be doing this anymore. If the idea of the gate is open, it means this is still possible, that you can still add to the decisions of the community in this way. And the majority today actually say there's no more ijtihad, that the gate's closed. But nonetheless, it's through these processes that we have the Sharia compiled. Okay, so from the ijma, from the hadith, from the Quran, we get this body of law. Now, with the Shia, things are a little bit different. The Shia also have law, but they totally reject the idea of an ijma, as you would expect, because they're outside the consensus, right? They're the minority. They're marginalized by the Sunni. They only make up 15% of the Islamic community. So obviously they're not going to be part of a consensus, no matter what their opinion wouldn't be, weighty enough to oversway the majority of the other opinion. But they don't even need an idea of the ijma because they have in place of that the imam, right? The inspired successor of Ali, who would be able to speak infallibly, kind of ex cathedra for the ummah. So you don't need a shura process. The only problem here is, of course, for most of the Shia, there's no current imam. Anyways, the visual on the slide, by the way, shows the 12 imams' names surrounding Muhammad in the center. All right, because remember, the majority are the 12ers. They only follow 12 imams. Now, as far as schools of law go, or schools of fiqh, jurisprudence, between 750 and 900 AD, you've got different legal traditions begin to emerge, and there's no uniformity, which is a problem. You got different bodies of law coming up. And you've got scholars in the big centers like Damascus and Medina and Baghdad that are trying to consolidate the schools of law into specific traditions. So among the Sunni, we could speak of 4 orthodox schools, madhab, okay, of fiqh, or of jurisprudence. The 4 schools of law, let's just call them the 4 schools of Sharia, are these. The Maliki school, founded by Malik ibn Anas. Major characteristics is that it's going to use the hadith. It's going to put a lot of reliance on the hadith as a basis of law. And this is actually going to be the closest to, they believe, Muhammad's actual practice. Of course, if you're relying on the hadith, you're relying on what did Muhammad do. So he's kind of the guide for law. The Maliki law book, by the way, what Malik composed, is actually the earliest known Muslim legal text that we have. All right, the next school is the Hanafi school. The Hanafi school is founded by Numan ibn Thabit. This is the largest school, and is the most liberal of the Sunni schools. And when I mean liberal, they're open to things that other schools are closed to. So, for instance, they permit marriage between Muslims and non-Muslims. That would be something usually forbidden. So they allow that, which puts them in that kind of liberal category. They also stress the use of ijtihad, as you would imagine. They're open to this idea as well. And they use other ways to kind of make decisions, like what's known as qiyya, or analogy. If we're looking at a situation here and a situation in the past, are they analogous? Are they similar? And with analogy, you can kind of make legal decisions that way too. Anyways, that's the largest of the schools. The next school is the Shafi school. By al-Shafi is the founder, and he was actually a relative of Muhammad's, right? A descendant of the Quraysh tribe. And the big focus in the Shafi school is the focus on ijma, or consensus. Okay. Then the last of the 4 major schools is going to be the Hanbali school. And the Hanbali school is the most conservative. So where the Hanafi school is the most liberal, the Hanbali school is the most conservative. So they do not allow, for instance, marriage between Muslims and non-Muslims. They condemn that. They are extremely literal when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran. They place primary emphasis on the hadith as a source of Sharia, and they reject innovations that are made by other schools and certain religious figures. Again, so they're kind of a purist movement. And they began in Baghdad, but today the Hanbali school is really, really strong in Saudi Arabia. In particular, if you're familiar with the Wahhabi sect, which is one of the most puritanical sects of Islam, they are adherents to the Hanbali school of law. Okay. Now, like I said, like there are other hadith collections, there are other schools of law as well, but all of them of lesser importance. Now, in the Shia tradition, there's only really one school, though it has many branches to the school, and that's called the Jafari school, or the Jafri school, following the 6th Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq. Now, he, remember, is a descendant of Ali, as all Islamic imams are. And there's a bit of a dispute as to, remember, the succession from him, right? The 6th Imam, he's the one everybody agrees on, with the exception of the Zaydis, or the Fivers. But after him, you have that split between the Ismaili, 7ers, and the 12ers. So we already went through that. But anyways, even though he's a Shia Imam, an important scholar there, he was somebody who is, or still is, somebody very well respected by the Sunni. And probably because some of his notable students happen to be some of the founders of the big schools in Sunni Islam. So, for instance, Malik ibn Anas, the founder of the Maliki school, and Numan ibn Thabit, the founder of the Hanafi school, both studied under Jafari. All right. You also have, as far as his adherents within the area of Shia, of course, the Ithna-Ashari, the 12ers, the Ismailis, some of the Zaydis, all adhere to his law code. Okay. Now, there are different branches within. Some of these branches accept ijtihad, some don't. That's not that important. But one major school in Shia, if you're going to kind of simplify things, and 4 major schools in Sunni as far as law goes. But it's not just law schools that exist, right? You also have schools of theology that are going to be different. So if we talk about the schools of what's known as kalam is philosophical theology for the most part. Within Sunni, you have a number of different theological schools. The Mutazilite would be an early one that develops really between the 8th and 10th centuries. This was really, really strong in the areas like Baghdad. It was founded by Wasil ibn Atta. And the interesting thing about these guys, since we've been spending so much time talking about philosophy over the course of this semester, they were guys that really focus on reason and rational thought as the guide to theology. And they depended heavily on Greek philosophy, in particular Aristotle. All right, now, to give you an example, when they talk about the oneness of Allah, Tawheed, which is a core doctrine in Islam, right? The idea that Allah is absolutely one. When they view it, they talk about Tawheed in a very metaphysical sense, kind of in an Aristotelian sense, this idea that the divine essence of Allah is absolutely simple, is absolutely one, and is eternal. And that the Quran, which is often referred to as something that is co-eternal with Allah, cannot actually be co-eternal, because that would mean there is something besides Allah, right? That there wouldn't be a complete unity. So they kind of regard the Quran as a created thing. And when it comes to his attributes, or the attributes of Allah, those are merely metaphorical. So when the Quran speaks of God in this way or that way, it's metaphor, because you can't really ascribe attributes to a completely simple being in a literal way. All right, so that's this idea of Tawheed. They also use the emphasis on reason when it comes to issues like ethics, how you live your life, what you're supposed to do. And they believe that this takes precedence even over sacred example that has come beforehand in revelation and things like that. And it's because, again, obligations in religion are only obligatory when it comes to reason, right? It's only, obligations have to be rational obligations. And if it's not rational, then it's not really an obligation. So reason trumps, this or that precedent. Anyways, response to the Mutazilite school was what's known as the Asharite school, or the Ashari, founded by Abu al-Hasan al-Ashari. Now, this focuses on revelation as opposed to reason, right? So revelation is much more important than human reason. As a matter of fact, human reason is limited. When it comes to ethics, you cannot figure out right and wrong merely by reflecting on things rationally. You need something outside, like a command from Allah, which means the Quran, the Sunnah, become the sole source of all morality for the Islamic community. Even when it comes to the idea of Tawheed, the idea of the oneness of God, they believe in Allah being one, but they actually believe his attributes are real things. It's just not metaphors, or they're real. Okay, and of course the Quran for them is something that's eternal. It's always been there. It's uncreated. Now, the big thinker in the Ashari school is going to be Al-Ghazali. Okay, so Al-Ghazali wrote a work actually called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which was directed against the Mutazilite school. And then he's also going to be instrumental in the development of Sufism, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. The funny thing is that you do have other kind of Aristotelian thinkers in Islamic tradition that come back and respond to Al-Ghazali himself, and I always forget if it's Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina that wrote a work. Off the top of my head, I don't recall, a work called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, kind of refuting Al-Ghazali. But again, that's kind of a debate between the Mutazilites and the Asharite schools. The last two schools are I don't want to say less significant, but the Maturidi school is founded by Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. Again, systematic theology, very similar to the Ashari school. As a matter of fact, because of the similarities, those are the two dominant groups today in Sunni Islam. Okay, the Asharite school and the Maturidi school. And then lastly, you've got the Murji'a school, which is a reaction really to the Kharijites, right? This whole idea of saying who is a true Muslim versus who is not a true Muslim. One of the big distinctions in the Murji'a school is that they are delayers, right? These are ones who postpone. That's where the name comes from. And they kind of delay judgment. They don't judge, who's a true Muslim, who's a false Muslim. That's kind of the distinctive in that particular school. So those are some of the theological schools. In the Shia tradition, the theological schools actually follow along with the division of the imams. So you have groups like the Imamis or the Ithna-Ashari who follow the 12th imam. That's the largest branch. Like I said, 85% of Shia are 12ers, are the Ithna-Ashari. Then you've got the Ismaili. Those are the ones that follow the 7th imam as Ismail. They actually bring in some other interesting ideas of a Quranic interpretation, Gnostic emphasis, this idea of secret knowledge, hidden meaning within the Quran. This is going to be really important in motivating what's known as the Sufi movement, which we have yet to get to. Then you've got the Fivers, the Zaydis. Of course, they're the ones that follow Zayd as the fifth imam. And they're fairly moderate. They accept certain types of things that are very much more in line with Sunni Islam. So they're very similar to Sunni in a certain sense. And then lastly, I'll just throw in the Alawites, who are known as the followers of Ali. And that's a difficult group as far as classification, because a lot of the Shia don't consider them Shia, and some don't even consider them Muslims at all. And they are one of the most liberal of the theological schools. Okay, they actually allow the drinking of alcohol, which is forbidden generally in Islam. So there's just a taste of some of the different theological schools, Sunni and Shia, side by side, which of course are going to bring up all kinds of differences in the theology, which we don't need to get into. But last few distinctions, I'll just throw these in as other distinctions. These are going to be a little bit more brief. But when it comes to the Shahada, right, we already talked about last time when we talked about the 5 pillars that the Sunni Shahada is very simple. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. There's nothing else added to that statement. But the Shia go ahead and, of course, add that third line, that Ali is the vice-regent of Allah, or Ali is the friend of Allah. Literally, Ali is the wali of Allah. Okay. Now, interestingly, at least from my perspective, I think of this as somewhat parallel to the Filioque debate between Eastern and Western Christianity. Right, the addition of one particular word, and it's not obviously the same thing, but it's similar in that this is the addition of a word or a phrase to a fundamental confession that has theological implications and is a huge mark of distinction between the two sides. Okay, so we have seen things like this before. When it comes to pilgrimage, let's talk about pilgrimage sites as being something very different. When it comes to the Hajj, of course, the Sunni have the major centers at Mecca, and you also have Hajj, the extended Hajj, which might take you to Medina, and even if you have time and the money to do it, all the way up to Jerusalem. So you could see sites not only like the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, but you've got the Prophet's Mosque and the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Medina, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Now, the Shia, of course, also go on Hajj to Mecca, and a number of those holy sites are holy to them as well, but they have their own unique sites in addition. So they would visit various sites at various times, like the tomb of Ali is very important in Iraq, as well as the tomb of Imam Hussein at Karbala. And then in Iran, the tomb of the 8th Imam, Ali al-Rida at Mashhad, and his sister Fatima at Qom are also two really, really holy sites within Iran. Okay, so a little bit different in that the Sunni will not do pilgrimages to those sites. Those are strictly Shia sanctuaries. Other distinctions have to do with the idea maybe of divine sovereignty. So, for instance, the Sunni emphasize that Allah is absolutely sovereign, even to the extent that it's a version of predestination, that you have everything in some sense controlled by Allah, including who makes it to heaven and who goes to hell. This is ultimately in the hands of Allah. Okay, nobody is in a position to change Allah's mind. The Shia have a little bit more room for human freedom. And I don't want to get into a whole debate about, predestination and human freedom. We kind of discussed this in the history of, thought and religion over the course of the semester, because we saw this thing being wrestled with in the plays by Sophocles, right? Oedipus Rex deals with this idea of, fate and free will. Christian theology, other philosophies deal with this. It's not just unique, again, to the Muslim world, but they too deal with this issue of freedom and predestination. You also have a difference in the idea of what's known as the Mahdi. And I brought up that word before, but I didn't really unpack it for you. Let's look at the Sunni side of things. The Mahdi, which is a rightly guided figure, right? This is usually referred to as an eschatological Messiah. Eschatological meaning it has to do with the end days. They believe often that the Mahdi is this future, as of yet not born figure that is going to come to accompany Isa, the return of Isa. Isa is the name for Jesus in Islam. And the Mahdi will come with Isa to end evil and do battle against Al-Dajjal, the deceiver, or Satan, at the end. And then will remain and rule for a certain period of years prior to the resurrection at the end. Okay, so that's a view of the Mahdi. Now, this particular teaching is actually not found in the Quran. It's actually found in some hadith, not in Al-Bukhari, but in other hadith collections. So it's pretty popular, but it's never been an official core doctrine in Sunni Islam. And a lot of Sunni actually outright reject the idea and think the only coming one is going to be Isa himself. There's no Mahdi, and if there is a Mahdi, it must be Isa himself. Now, the Shia They've got a more complicated view of the Mahdi. Most Shia accept the idea of a Mahdi, but they disagree as to who it's going to be. What's the identity? Depends on the sect that you belong to. And a lot of people believe that this Mahdi has already been born and is in hiding, which is known as occultation. So, for instance, the dominant group, the Ithna-Ashari, the 12ers, they believe that Muhammad al-Mahdi, the 12th Imam, is the future Mahdi, that he disappeared in 874 and is still alive somewhere in the world and is going to come back at the end, at the proper moment. Other groups disagree. Of course, the Druze think it's al-Hakim. The Druze is a really interesting group. A lot of people don't view the Druze as real Muslims either. Again, every group doesn't necessarily view other groups as true Muslims. But Ad-Darazi, who was the founder of the Druze, actually proclaimed al-Hakim, the Imam al-Hakim, and Fatimid Caliph, as an incarnation of Allah, which is really, really bizarre if you think of what Orthodox Islam teaches. Allah wouldn't become incarnate, but the Druze actually believe al-Hakim is the incarnation and is going to be the Mahdi figure in the future. But again, there's a lot of other debate as to the identity of the Mahdi between Sunni and Shia. Lastly, as far as distinctions go, I think I'm just going to bring up Muta because I've mentioned it in the past when it comes to Sharia schools. And it's bizarre maybe to Western culture to think of this type of thing, but Muta is an idea of temporary marriage. All right, it's a temporary, it was a custom actually in pre-Islamic times in Arabia. And the Sunni outright reject this idea. A temporary marriage, obviously a marriage that you enter into for a short period of time knowing it's going to end. It's not a permanent marriage. It's rejected completely, like I said, by the Sunni, but it is accepted by certain groups among the Shia, which is interesting. And for instance, the Jafari school says it is acceptable to practice muta marriage. And Jafar himself considered it a type of mercy to help you avoid the sin of fornication. So you can imagine yourself as a young Muslim youth who is dating and wants to engage in sexuality. And you can enter into one of these marriage contracts, this muta marriage, and you'll be able to have sex while you're dating. And then, of course, when you're done, you cancel the marriage and move on to your future marriage, and it won't be considered sinful act of fornication, according to this doctrine. You can see why it'd be kind of controversial and why a lot of the Sunni groups kind of reject it. But Jafar not only said it was permissible, he actually advocated it. He actually recommended that every Muslim at least once engage in muta marriage. So that's a big difference, again, between the two groups. Last thing I want to talk about, though, is Sufism. I'm going to try to do this briefly, but I didn't want to skip over Sufism because it's actually really, really important in the developing of Islam over the centuries. And it's really a transcendence beyond just Sunni and Shia. Okay, it's a form of what we might call mystical Islam. So let's talk about the origins and the etymology of Sufism. It's not a third group, number one, right? There's actually Sufis that are in Sunni and Sufis that are part of Shia. So it's kind of transcended both groups and penetrated into both camps in Islam. The etymology debate, right? Is it from the word suf, which means wool? This would be like kind of the rough clothing that an ascetic might wear, because early Sufism arises among these ascetics, these hermits. Or does it come from the word safa, which means purity? It really doesn't matter which it comes from, but the word itself is attached to this mystical Islam. And let's look at the stages of its development. We'll break these down to really 7 historical stages, and I'm going to do this really quickly. But the first stage between 661 and 850 was where we see these individual ascetic hermits come on the scene. This is like the individual Sufi saints. And they're promoting a personal encounter with Allah, some kind of personal union even with the divine. Second stage from 850 to 988, you've got Sufi poetry develop. And this was influenced by Christian mysticism, contemplation of union with God, and this idea of participating and experiencing divine love, which gives rise to poetry naturally. And then the third stage between 988 and 1075, you've got real movements develop. Communities emerge, right? Sufi monasteries and things like that. These groups coalesce. The fourth stage is 1075 to 1150, and here's where Al-Ghazali comes in. Now, Ghazali was one of the big thinkers, right, among the Ashari school. And he helps mainline Sufism. He makes it popular. He kind of defends Sufism because there were lots of things that really cut against the normative traditional Islam. Stage 5, you've got the classical poetic period between 1150 and 1250, and yet the great Sufi poets emerge on the scene, especially Rumi, who's probably the most famous, the dirty Sufi, Rumi. His poetry is really widely regarded in the world, not just in the Islamic world, but even beyond that. The 6th stage between 1250 and 1350 is Sufi missionary activity, where they're going out to kind of spread Sufism. And now from that point forward, we have a really consolidation of Sufi orders. And it's really complicated. There are hundreds of Sufi orders out there, but I'm going to give you at least a handful in a second. But let's describe it a little bit further. When I talk about mystical Islam, mystical experience, what we're talking about is an inner spirituality, right? This idea that seeks to unite man with God, a fusion of the divine. This here is an emblem that relates to the Sarwardi Qadri order. And what it is the heart with the word Allah written upon it. This idea that Allah actually comes to dwell inside somebody, in someone. Okay, this is something that's not foreign to maybe Christian tradition, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit or something like that. But it's not something that's particularly common in normative Islam. All right, so the classical Sufis are these mystics. They follow a very pious form of Islam, and they try to perfect their worship, what's known as ihsan, perfection of worship. And they believe that you can have direct personal experience of God through meditation and self-discipline. It actually cuts against the normal doctrine of the enthronement of Allah, that He doesn't come down and touch this world or interact with people, right? There's no incarnation of Allah. There's no indwelling of Allah. But again, they do believe in that here. And it's characterized by different practices, like the attachment to what's called the dhikr, which is any action that brings consciousness of God, His presence, and His love. And this could be something like repeating the names of Allah, right? The 99 names of Allah could be repeated over and over and over again until it brings you into this kind of contact. Or it could be done through dancing and music. So if you're familiar with the whirling dervishes, right? That's the Mevlevi sect. It's a picture of them on the screen there as they twirl around and around and around in a circle, try to go into harmony with the cosmos and get into an altered state of consciousness. So there are different types of methods for, uniting with God, not that unlike what we saw in the mystery religion of Dionysus worship, the Bacchic cult, right? And they also practice asceticism, meditation, and other practices. Okay, so that's what we mean by mystical. And they're willing very often to embrace other religious ideas that you find in Christianity and in Judaism and even in Hinduism. So it's really a syncretistic movement. Now, the tariqa are the orders. Those are the schools. The Sufi brotherhood is called the tariqa. And it was originally a set of the disciplines, right? The mental and physical exercises that you do to bring you into union with God. But it comes to refer to any group that follows a leader like a sheikh or a pir. All right, so a sheikh just means a teacher. It's literally an old man. And a pir is a Sufi master, a mystic who guides the community. All right, so most tariqa are centered around a sheikh or a pir. Among the major tariqa, I'm going to give you 4. The Chisti, number 1, is a group that actually believes that spiritual power can be transmitted through material objects. Okay, that a Sufi saint can touch a material object and transmit spiritual power. This is similar to what we see in Christianity, especially Eastern Orthodox Christianity, with the use of the icons, right, or the relics that have the ability to heal and things like that. So that kind of attachment to a material object for blessings. The Shurawardi sect believes in intercessory power, that their founder, Shurawardi, has intercessory ability to give forgiveness and bestow salvation. Right? This is also something that we see in the idea of Christianity with the intercessory function of Christ, right, for the believers. The Qadriya sect emphasizes meditation and esoteric experience that actually will bring you even the possibility of what's called ecstatic translation. Sufi saints could be translated, and what that means is not due to language. It means a translation out of the body, right? Kind of out-of-body experience. This is like what Muhammad has when we talk about the night journey of Muhammad, where he's taken spiritually out of his body in Medina and brought to Jerusalem. They believe in that kind of thing, right? Something like Doctor Strange would do in the Marvel comics. Also, God intoxication, the idea of being indwelt in this enthusiasm, right? The enthusiasm is the Greek word that we mean, talking about Dionysus indwelling somebody. They believe in that type of thing, which would include speaking in tongues, okay? Things that we might associate with, certain Christian groups today. All right, and this is also very much a group that is Shia in orientation. As a matter of fact, that's their banner that I have on the screen, and it basically says that Ali is the authority of Allah on earth. So again, this is very much a Shia group. And then the last group, the last I'll give you, is the Naqshbandi order, which is the main group among the Sunnis. And they are obviously more conservative. They reject music and dance and ecstatic experience, and they adhere much more closely to the typical Quran Hadith tradition in Islam. So again, you've got Sufi orders that are all over the place, across the board, Sunni and Shia, with a lot of distinctions. So lastly, let me just give you a very brief rundown of the basic differences between Sufism and normative Islam. If we're going to think about the 6 differences, we're going to start with the idea that Sufism is definitely contemplative and mystical. Sufism is also non-legalistic. It kind of rejects this idea of the absolute transcendence of Allah. It rejects Islam as just a body of laws. It rejects viewing Islam as simply Sharia, okay, the legal path. No, this is more than that. This is an intimate, personal path. It's individualistic, as opposed to all about the ummah or the body. All right, it's about the individual. It's also syncretistic because it embraces non-Islamic ideas, kind of mixes them in. We've seen that word. I know I brought it up when we talked about Roman religion being syncretistic, welcoming other ideas into the mix. It also finds esotericisms within the Quran and the Hadith. Now, what that means is you can read a passage, a surah, or an ayah, verse of the Quran, and there will be an external meaning, but there will also be an internal hidden meaning that you have to delve a little bit deeper to get something else out. So Allah is speaking to you on multiple levels in those books. You also have the emphasis on the role of the peer as the mediator, right? This is the person who guides the tariq. The mediator, again, Rumi, he actually talks about this. I'll give you a quote from Rumi where he's speaking of the peer. He says, "Come under the shadow of the man of reason. Thou cannot find it in the road of the traditionalist. That man alone enjoys close proximity to Allah." So here he is in this passage rejecting the traditionalist approach to religion and advocating adhering to a peer as a guide to spirituality. Okay, so very, very different. And all of this really is there to kind of give you the idea, or at least the illustration of Islam as a complicated religion. It's not as simplistic as there's Sunni, there's Shia. There are subsects all over the place. You have Sufism. All right, so to kind of wrap this up, just want to think about the Sunni Shia division. Remember, 30 years after the death of Muhammad, you've got a split, a major split, which should recall a major split in Christianity that took place as well, the Great Schism in 1054. Now, you could look at that date of 1054, which is 1,000 years after the crucifixion of Christ, and say, okay, Islam split very early in its infancy, and Christianity split after 1,000 years. Therefore, Christianity is much more unified historically than Islam has been. Now, that's not exactly the case, though, right? Because if you go back to early Christianity, you have lots of different groups practicing Christianity in different ways, right? You've got Arians, Monophysites, Nestorians, and various other groups that the early church councils were called to address, these things that were eventually considered heresy. And what eventually emerges, remember, is Orthodox Christianity, okay, in the low O sense of Orthodox, right? This idea of proper teaching, which kind of becomes the monolith when it comes to European tradition. And a lot of those other sects were suppressed and dwindled in some ways, but some of these groups actually still survive even to this day. So again, early Christianity was still very diverse. It's a complicated picture. As a matter of fact, Christianity is about as complicated as the divisions that we have in Islam. We talk about all these different subsects popping up among the Shias. They follow different imams. But it only seems so complicated to us because from a Western point of view, we don't know as much about the Islamic world. But if you think about it for a second, Christianity has the same complications, because when we get to the 16th century, something we really haven't discussed, or didn't have the opportunity to discuss, but the Protestant Reformation takes place. And it's a rejection of the hierarchical structure in Roman Catholicism. What happens with the Protestant movement, you end up with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian denominations that are existing today. So Christianity is about as fragmented as Islam is. The other thing that I want to just kind of wrap up by discussing is the Sufi movement, right? The Sufi movement is this idea of going for some kind of personal connection and unity with God. Now, as we've covered the history of religion over the course of these lectures, we can go all the way back to ancient paganism, particularly in the Greek and Roman world. And we saw a reaction to the requirements of the civic cult, right? The state religion that the Greeks and the Romans promoted. You have the reaction by the development of a personal form of religion that was found in the mystery cults, right? The idea of indwelling of God, the idea of promise of salvation, blessing, something that's giving you certain benefits that you don't get as to the state-run cult. Same thing comes out in Christianity. I mean, Christianity is, in a way, a reaction to a legalistic tendency within Judaism, right? That's one of the reasons Jesus had such a run-in with the Pharisees, right? He saw them as overly legalistic. So Christianity tends to be a movement towards a more personal religion, the idea that God has come down to earth, that the Holy Spirit can indwell somebody. And even within the early centuries of Christianity, you've got other movements like the Montanist sect, which believes in revelation going on, the gifts of the Spirit. This is something that the church father Tertullian got involved with. And if you get back again to the Protestant Reformation, which I just mentioned, it was the same type of thing. You got to cut out the priest who stands over the Roman Catholic tradition. People can come directly to God in a more personal sense. That was a big motive in the Protestant Reformation. And again, you can continue to the modern day with charismatic movements and all these different traditions. Okay, so what goes on in Sufism is not unique. I mean, it's unique in the sense of the world that it springs up in, but it's, again, this movement from a legal, rigid practice of a religion to a more personal and intimate practice of a religion. Anyways, that's kind of wrapping up our discussion of Islam, and I think it's also appropriate to wrap up the whole course of lectures at this point because we've come basically full circle. We started, if you remember, the beginning of the lecture series in the ancient Near East, right, with the civilization of Sumeria, and we've come all the way back to the ancient Near East now in the medieval world and even up to the modern world. So hopefully in the course of all of these lectures, you found some of these things actually rather interesting. And if not interesting, maybe useful in a certain sense. But I do appreciate that you've watched these lectures, and thank you so much.